Hi, my name is Matt. Welcome to my shop and welcome to the assembly instructions for a chair kit in style 6, and we're gonna jump right in. So we're gonna go through the parts and take a look at each component to help familiarize yourselves with every part and how they all kind of go together and interact. If you're doing more than one chair, this is also a good time to group parts together into chairs that actually cohesively work together. Wood is a natural material. It does have some variations. So if you play around with the pieces a little bit between every chair, you can get a chair that kind of flows a little better than being completely mismatched. So pay attention to green and color as you're going through this sort of sorting process. So the first thing you're gonna have is gonna be the seat. That is gonna be the biggest thing in the box. And with that, you're also gonna have your hardware kit. These will be your corner blocks, which will connect the frame corners together, as well as the screws that connect those blocks to the frame and hold the seat down to the frame as well. Another large component is going to be the rear legs. These are going to have mortises about halfway up. These are going to be for the lower rail. And you can see here I have a left and right leg. And in the front of the leg, you'll have mortises for the side rails. Towards the front of the chair, we're going to have the front legs. So these are going to have mortises for the front rails and the side rails, both the wide side rail and the narrow side rail. We also have the back slats. And these are also going to have a left and right. That's going to be indicated by the little cut here on the top. Along the bottom of the chair is going to be the lower rail. This curved rail is going to house the back slats. It's going to connect into the rear legs. The top rail or crest rail is going to receive both the back slats into the big mortises down here and the rear legs into the mortises here on the ends. Lastly, we can get into the frame rails. Those are going to be the two side rails, or the four side rails, two on each side, the wide one and the narrow one, and then the front rail. We'll take a look at the front rail first. Since it's the simplest, it just has a tenon on either end, and both these ends are square. The side rails are a little more interesting because the chair frame is tapered from front to back, so we have angled tenons on both the wide side rail and the narrow side rail. So on this end, you can see we have some fun angled tenons here. These are going to go into the back legs. And in the front, we do have a little bit of an angle on this side, not nearly as drastic as the back side, but these are angled as well. So just keep that in mind as you're kind of working through all your parts. So those are all the parts. And next we're going to run through a dry assembly. It's a good idea to at least dry assemble all your chairs to make sure everything comes together as it should. And if you haven't put one together yet, it also helps you get more familiar with how everything is supposed to come together. Another little tip here too is if you are doing multiple chairs and you're not super comfortable with this whole process, it's a really good idea to take just one chair through the entire process from start to finish so you get a really good feel for all the little things that might trip you up along the way. So we're going to start with the back assembly. So I have the rear legs, the lower rail, the crest rail, as well as the back slats, which are over here. So I have my 5 components here, and I'm going to start by installing the back slats. So those are going to go down here into the mortises in the lower rail. And again, we have left and right here, so we want the peaks here to be on the outside. Now I can slip the back slats into the crest rail. Then lastly, I can install the legs. So I have one tenon up here, which goes into the crest rail, and then I have a mortise down here, which is going to receive the tenon on the lower rail. So that is the completed back assembly. And next I want to do the front sub-assembly, which is going to be the 2 front legs and that front rail. To set up the orientation for the front legs, I have the single mortise face here facing each other. And in this case, I have the 2 mortises here. These are going to be for the side rails. They're facing up, so I can spread those apart, and I can drop the front rail in between the 2 legs. That takes care of another sub-assembly. Now back to the back frame of the chair. I want to install the side rails into the back frame next, and then we'll set the front assembly up on top of that. The wide side rails just slip right into the top mortise. And the narrower lower rails just fit into these lower mortises here. the crazy angled end is going to be the end that goes down into the back of the chair. And with these ones, you just want to make sure you're putting them in the right direction. So the correct direction should have them bottom out and be parallel here with this rail. It's pretty easy to put them in the wrong way, but it's also very obvious. Like this one that's definitely the wrong way. And if you mix up the side that it goes on, so this is this side's lower rail, and I put it on this side, you can see it's angling all wonky this way. So this is not the correct rail for this side of the chair. I highly recommend labeling these things as you get your dry assemblies put together. That way when you go to reassemble this thing with actual glue, you won't have any kind of surprises or mix-ups. So those are all set. Now I can drop on the front assembly. So that is the dry assembly of the chair frame. Let's set this thing up here like that. And we can just throw the seat on here to get a feel for how it's going to look. And that is how our assembled chair should come back together once we're fully done with getting it ready to go. Now that we've familiarized ourselves with all the parts and how they all come together to make, a chair, we can go through and actually start all the finish prep and get this thing ready for assembly. Again, if you're happy with this kind of layout, make sure you label all your parts and you organize all your parts by chair so you can put everything back exactly as you had it at this point. Especially if you're doing a lot of these things, you're going to find out that there's a significant number of parts here, so labeling is definitely a good idea. So I'm going to pull this thing apart and then we'll talk about all the little detail things we can do on this chair to make sure it's ready to go for finish and assembly. So the first thing we'll talk about is going to be edge treatment, and this is an area where you can really just choose to do whatever you want, whatever looks good for you. The profile, the radius, the edge break you put on all your parts is totally aesthetic and it's completely up to you. I prefer a little more of a sharper, crisper corner, so I do a very light edge break. And one thing you'll notice on all the parts, all your edges are going to be pre-broken just a little bit. That makes them a lot easier to handle as they're being shipped and as you're working with them in your shop. So you can just keep them like this and keep this light edge break, or you can go bigger if you want to do something a little more softer looking. Everywhere is aesthetic except for one place that I'll point out, and that's going to be on the seat. So over here on this front edge, this is where the back of your legs are going to be riding against as you're sitting in the seat. So there is a light edge break on the front which matches the edges and the sides and everything. But this is an area where you might want to soften that edge a little bit to make it a little more comfortable for someone sitting in that chair. Now, one thing on the seats, you can see it does have this sort of S profile. So as you're sitting in here, this is already kind of rolling downwards. So you don't need as heavy a round over as you might think, but you may want to put something a little bit heavier on there. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go from this roughly maybe 1/8 inch round over to a 1/4 inch round over. That'll really soften this up quite a bit and make it just a little bit more comfortable. There's one little detail here that you want to consider. That's how that round over plays into the round over or the edge break or the edge profile that's going on along the sides as you meet the front. It's totally up to you if you want to continue that round over around the corner and also make the sides a little bit of a heavier round over. For me, I want the sides to have a similar edge treatment as the rest of the chair, so I'm going to leave those with a sharper edge. And what I'll do is just stop the round over a little bit back from the corner, just kind of blend things out manually from the round over out to the corner, so we have sort of a little tapered ramp area that transitions from the round over profile on the front to the sort of edge break on the side. One other edge treatment detail that is completely functional and not aesthetic at all is going to be the bottoms of the legs. So you want to make sure you knock off the edges on all the legs. That way, if the chair is dragged across the ground, you don't have a piece of the leg get chipped off. That just protects the leg from any splinters or chips. So this is really easy to take care of. You can do that with a router, you can do it with a hand plane, or you can just hit it real quick with a sander. You're just trying to knock off that sharp corner, make it a little more rounded over, and just ease that material back. So no edge break and a little bit of edge break. I can do the same thing on the rear legs as well. So next we can get into the surface prep, getting these all sanded and nice and ready to go for finish. So there are two kind of categories of things that we're dealing with here. We have the easy things, the flat and rectilinear parts, which are very easy to deal with. And then we have the curved parts, which present their own sort of challenges as far as the surface prep goes. But otherwise, everything needs to be finish sanded to whatever finish sanding level you want to take it to. I'm going to run through and do the easy parts first. That's going to be all of the rails, the rear legs. They have the two kind of curved faces that are flat. That's easy to do with the power sander. The convex side can also be done with a power sander, just being very careful, especially as you get in here. This area here is flat, so you don't want to end up curving this area and having a gap there where your rail seats. So keep that in mind as well. The convex side of this part, as well as all of the other curved parts, unless you have a like a drum sander type of thing, a freehanding drum sander thing, the easiest way to do this is just going to be hand sanding. The nice thing about this is that the surface is kind of rough sanded or initial sanded for you, so you're just doing a lot of refining things here, smoothing out the surface, getting rid of the scratch pattern from the rougher sandpaper. So for the curved parts, that's all going to be hand sanded, and then where it's possible, a power sander is going to be just fine for the rest of the parts. So I'm going to run through the grits on those flat parts, and then I can go over to the curved parts and start working those through the grits with some hand sanding. Again, it's not like we're doing a whole lot of heavy duty hand sanding, this is just more refining sanding, which is super nice, so that process goes really quickly. Now, one part that might get you in a little bit of trouble is going to be the front legs, because you have both concave and convex areas there. So let's make sure you're paying attention to what face you're working on, so you don't end up gouging something if you're trying to sand a concave face with a power sander. Essentially, half the sanding is going to be with a power sander and the other half is going to be hand sanding. Or if you want to be crazy, you can hand sand the entire thing. That's totally up to you. So our parts are all finished, prepped, sanded, and ready to go. And congratulations, you have reached a fork in the road. Do you continue and go to assembly and then finishing? Or do you go to finishing and then to assembly? So there are a few different considerations here. First off, I feel that it is a lot easier to finish these chairs if you go to finishing next and then do a final assembly later. Pre-finishing is going to be incredibly easy compared to trying to finish a fully assembled chair. With pre-finishing, all you have to worry about is finishing this part just in space by itself. It's not connected to another part that you now have inside corners to deal with, and make sure they don't have any runs, drips, or puddles or anything weird going on in there. Now, a couple instances where assembling the chair first and then finishing second would be relatively easy. First would be if you are spraying your finish and you are pretty good at spraying. Spraying individual parts is still going to be easier than spraying a whole chair, so keep that in mind. If you don't have a whole lot of spraying experience, you may want to do the parts individually first, do a pre-finishing, and then do your actual finishing after that. The other instance where applying the finish after assembly is going to make sense is going to be if you're doing an oil finish, because with those, you're typically just applying a one coat, letting the wood soak up what it wants to, wiping off the excess, and you're done. So if you're not doing anything that's going to be building a film, you don't have to really worry about inside corners, drips, and runs at all. Now, the one disadvantage of doing the pre-finishing method is there is a little bit more prep work, and you do have more stuff to apply finish to. If you're applying finish to an assembled chair, you have one chair to apply finish to. If you're pre-finishing, you have however many parts for every single chair that need to be set up, finished, and you need the space for that. The other thing is you do have a little more prep work to do because you have all these glue surfaces that you don't want any finish to get on. So for tenons, that's gonna be really easy. You can use some masking tape and mask them all off. Super easy. The other thing is going to be with the mortises. You don't want any finish getting down into the mortises. So a couple of things you can do. You can try and mask off the mortises on the inside there with some masking tape, or what also works really well for is blocking finish from getting in there is backer rod. You can get that at the home center. You can cut that to whatever length you need and stuff it into the mortise, and that'll prevent finish from getting down in there. But really, anything you can put in the mortise to block finish from getting in there is going to be beneficial. Now, when I'm applying finish to parts like these, I'm just really careful when I'm around the mortise because I'm hand applying. If you're spraying, it's a totally different situation. You have to physically prevent finish from being sprayed into the mortises. But if you're hand applying, generally if you're doing a lighter coat finish like I'll be showing, it's not too difficult to just not force finish down into the mortises. So you'll see I don't typically actually protect the mortises. As far as the tenons go, I will protect one end, the end that I'll hold, and you'll just see in a second, I'll show you how you can actually hang up all your parts to make this a lot easier. Because that's gonna be one of the more kind of interesting things with this is finding a way to hold all these parts so you can get it all sides all at once without laying them on something and ruining your finish. So let me show you some of the setup here to get ready for pre-finishing. So this is how I have all my parts set up for finishing. They're all hanging here from this garage rail. I can grab the tenon that's masked off with my hand and apply finish and let go, and there's nothing to worry about. Nothing's gonna touch it, nothing's gonna interfere with my finish. It's a very easy and clean way of doing this. There's a lot of different ways to hang your parts. I'm using screws into the tenons, but there's a few different alternatives if you wanted to do something a little different. So first off, if you have some spring clamps, one thing you can do as a variation of this, I have my strings tied directly to this garage rail, but if you had like a joist or something overhead that you can clamp things to, you can use a spring clamp on one end of the string, and that will allow you to move the part around or hang it from different spots, or just have a little more flexibility of where you're hanging it. If you're going to do this a lot, it also gives the opportunity to break down your hanging area, so you can take all your spring clamps, put them in a box. You don't have stuff hanging from the ceiling, and you don't have to set up a bunch of string again if you want to use it again. Now you can do the inverse or combination of that too. You can put a spring clamp onto the workpiece. So if you have something that's going to be grabbable, like a tenon or a screw in the end of the workpiece, you can grab it with a spring clamp. It's a little bit easier and faster than tying every single piece up with your string. So for all these parts, I use screws into the tenons, and these are just the screws that come in the hardware pack. It's a good time to use these before they are used again for assembly. So into all of these, I have the shorter 1 1/4" screws, and most of all the parts have something that can receive a screw that's not going to be seen in the future. So of course, all the pieces with tenons, you can use those as anchor points. The legs, the front legs, you can use either the top or the bottom. And then for the rear legs, you can use either the tenon on top, or you can go directly into the bottom of the leg, your choice. Now there's one part that might give you a little bit of confusion as to how to hold it. That's going to be the crest rail. Because this part doesn't really have anything that you can grab or attach to. It's not going to be seen in the finished piece. So what I like to do is take one of the longer screws from the hardware pack and actually put that down into one of the mortises for the back slat. That's going to give you a place to anchor to, and that's not going to be seen when you do the assembly later on. Now, something to keep in mind, the screws are self-drilling, the ones that come with the kit, but on the tenons, you're going into end grain, so that might be a little more delicate. It could be a good idea to drill yourself a pilot hole, but generally, with this sort of hanging operation, these pieces don't weigh a lot. They're not going to be under a lot of stress. You don't need to drive these screws very deeply. I just have the ones up here engaged just to the bottom of where the little self-drilling area stops. So there's only a few threads engaged, but they're not really going anywhere either. For the seat, I'm using painter's pyramids, and we'll start with the bottom up. That way we'll apply finish to this side first, This side will go down onto the pyramids and we'll finish the top. We don't really care what the side looks like, just need some finish on there to balance things out. So I think that's all the prep work needs to happen, and now it's time to actually get into finishing. So a common question with the chair kits is, what's the best finish to use on them? And my answer to that is the best finish to use is the one that you can apply the best. Because if you try and use a finish that you can't apply very well, it doesn't matter how good your finish prep or anything goes, it's not going to look good. So whatever's the most comfortable finish for you to apply is a finish that you should use. And for me, I like a wiping varnish. I'm really comfortable with this finish. I get a really repeatable and reliable result. So that's what we'll be using on this chair kit. Normally I'll do a 5-coat application. The nice thing about the wiping varnishes is they're very forgiving because you are applying them in very small builds. So every coat is not quite inconsequential, but you do have the ability to go a little slower and not have to worry as much about streaking or runs or puddling or things like that. So for me at least, I'm really comfortable with this finish. So that's what we're going to use on this chair. So one last tip for you before we get into actually applying finish is you can use a solvent such as mineral spirits or denatured alcohol as an easy and quick way to test to make sure you haven't missed anything with your finish prep. So because this stuff just flashes off, but it will give you a actual look of finished wood, you can see like, oh, did I miss a scratch or that sand well enough and have some pigtails from a power sander or something. This will give you a really good preview that it's completely reversible because in a few minutes that mineral spirits will have flashed off and it'll be back to bare wood again, and I can apply finish, or I can go and address any issues I might see at that stage. So if I saw any scratches or something, I can come back and do a little touch up, a little bit of sanding and clean that up. So for this finish, I'm using Armor Seal, which is a wiping varnish, and I'm going to apply it with a cotton rag. So these are just rags that you get at the home center. There's a little cotton t-shirt material. And because I'm using this on the first coat, I'm going to use a secondary container here to make sure I don't get any contaminants into my can. And I can close up my can and I don't have my can exposed to air for nearly that long. So this first coat with the wiping varnish is just a seal coat. The wood's super thirsty at this point. It's going to pull finish deep into the fibers. You're not going to have any surface build at this point. And that's pretty true of the second coat as well. The second coat is sort of like a intermediary coat between the seal coat and the build coats. So coats 3 and 4 are the actual build coats. That's what we'll start building an actual surface film. And then the 5th coat will just be a refining coat kind of at the end. And I'll walk you through that as we go along here. So this is kind of a fun part. We've done all the work. We've got all our parts finished, prepped, and ready to go. And now we can just kind of sit back and apply finish and just enjoy the beauty of the wood just come to life. For me, at least, I really like finishing because it's just cathartic in a sense. I can just relax, get the finish applied, and just think about whatever. Think about the project, think about something else I got to do, whatever that might be. But some beautiful stuff come to life here. This first coat is very easy and very fun because there's not really any specific application technique. The wood's so thirsty at this point that it's going to pull in whatever material you put on the surface here. So you don't have to really worry about your application technique. As long as you get some finish on the wood, that's all that matters. You don't have to worry about streaking or really anything at this point. You can just enjoy the process. Now, last thing on the agenda is the seat. And again, the bottom doesn't really matter a whole lot because you are probably not going to see it unless you flip the chair upside down. But again, first coat with this, just kind of slop it on. That's really all it needs. Do the other side. Okay, so that is it for the first coat of finish. So we'll let this cure for a bit and then we'll come back and apply second coat. So the finish has had a few hours to cure, and next I'm going to start on the second coat, which begins with a little bit of sanding here. That's going to knock down any roughness, any dust nibs on the surface, and make the surface nice and smooth and ready for the next coat. So I have some 600 grit sandpaper here. It's going to give all the parts a really light sanding, and then I have a rag with some mineral spirits, which I'm going to use to wipe off any dust from the sanding that would be on the surface of the wood. So as we get into the second coat here, this is more of an intermediate coat. It goes on quite a bit thinner. You're trying to apply it a lot thinner than that first coat, but it can still be a little bit heavier than the third and fourth coats because at this point the wood is only like semi-sealed. That first coat still leaves the wood a little bit thirsty because it did get pulled in fairly deep. So you will have this second coat still absorbing quite a bit deeper, but this is really going to seal off the wood and allow the next two coats to really be able to build. So I'm not trying to apply it too thick, just trying to get the surface wet, just enough to get some finish pulled into the surface, leave a little bit of shine from the wetness, and then just kind of wiping it back just to make sure I don't have any drips or runs or anything. And that's another coat. I forgot this guy. On to coat number 3. This one's going to be a little bit lighter than that second coat. We don't want to leave a whole lot of material on the surface, just enough to kind of wet the surface a little bit and give us our first true build coat. That second coat again just kind of finalize the seal coat. The wood is fully sealed now after that second coat, and we can start actually working on the build, which is going to be the final surface. There we go. So just kind of get it wet, wipe it off, and move on. And typically with these coats here, second, third, and fourth, because they go on fairly light, they'll be dry enough to apply another coat in only a few hours, which is also kind of nice. So you can run through basically second through fifth coat in a day. First coat, because it's so heavy, usually takes 4 to 6 hours. So I'll do that like, if I'm really in a rush, I'll do that one like an evening or night before. And then the following day, I'll do all of the the coats, 2nd through 5th, and be done. But again, you know, use whatever finish you want. This is just the one that I happen to gravitate towards. So I did coat 4 off camera, since it's exactly the same thing as coat number 3. I've gone ahead and sanded and cleaned all the parts, and now applying my 5th and final coat. And again, you can apply as many coats as you want to get the build that you're looking for. I find that 5 is kind of a nice, mid-range level where you have a little bit of build, so you have a nice film on there. It's going to give the wood a good amount of protection. It's going to have a decent level of sheen to it, but it's not a super thick, like plasticky finish at that point either, which is what I like. So the 5th coat is what I'll call a fixing coat. One of the things you'll notice as you're sanding between coats is when you sand, especially if you're going to sand aggressively, that's going to change the sheen a little bit and make it uneven. So the 5th coat is going to fix the sanding that happened after the 4th coat. So all we're doing is applying a very thin layer on top. That's just going to even out the sheen and finalize things. One of the things we're doing with this is because we're applying it so thin, like I'm just getting the surface wet. I'm not really having a whole lot of material on the rag. It's just dampening the surface a little bit. So this coat is going to dry super fast because there's not that much material on the surface that needs to cure. So it's going to dry to the touch very quickly. And what that's going to do for us is it's going to prevent or minimize the time that dust particles can land in the finish, making that finish rough again. So as we get through this, we won't really have any cleanup to do after this point. There really shouldn't be any more heavy sanding that'll have to happen after this. The part should be pretty darn smooth from the get-go. And that's really what the fixing coat kind of describes or entails, really just finalizing things. After this, there really shouldn't be anything else left to do. We'll do a little light surface sanding, like super light after this, but other than that, really shouldn't be anything that needs to be corrected because we've taken care of all that after the 4th coat. So with the last coat of finish cured, the last thing I'm going to do is just do a little bit of touch-up work here. This is going to be a little bit of feeling and light sanding. So I'm feeling all the parts, looking for any areas that have any roughness or dustiness or anything. If I find any areas that are a little bit on the rough side, if I can, let's see here. This one's got a little bit of rough spot right there. I have some 1000 grit sandpaper, which has been used before. So like the finest sandpaper you can find, just give it a little. It's a very light little sanding just to knock off any of that roughness. You're not trying to change the sheen at all. We fixed that on the 5th coat. We just want to do any last little touch-up things to make everything super smooth. It's one of those things you want in a nice finish, is for the finish to be nice and smooth, because people are going to touch this, especially with it being a chair. Hands are going to be everywhere. So if you have any rough spots, now is the time to address any of those. So these are all feeling pretty good. So I think we can move forward with the actual assembly. So the assembly is going to be in 4 sort of stages. We'll have the rear assembly, the front assembly, the connecting assembly, and then we'll get into the seat attachment, I guess, not really assembly. So I'm going to start with the rear assembly since it is the most complicated of all of the assemblies by a little bit. So before we get started, I do want to walk you through the clamping strategies here because this is kind of a goofy and awkward thing to clamp up should you need it. A lot of times parts like the back slats and the leg into the crest rail connection, once those are seated together, they are kind of good, but if you need a little persuasion here or there, there's a few different things we can do to sort of address all of that. So I have this all dry assembled right now, which is also a good idea, just to put everything together, especially if you refinish them, in case you got some goop or something down in one of the mortises or something. This will tell you that everything's gonna come back together and it goes together pretty quickly. So the first thing I wanna show you is down here on the lower or bottom rail. The easiest way to clamp this up and the cheapest is going to be with a ratchet strap. So this is the same thing as a band clamp. This is going to allow us to apply pressure in through the sides and get these legs rolled correctly into this lower rail. The one thing you want to watch out for though is going to be the metal on that ratchet. So you want to put something between the wood and the ratchet to protect the wood from the ratchet, or else you're going to have some scratches and gouges as you go to start operating that ratchet. So that's going to be the clamping strategy down here for the bottom rail. I'm going to set that aside at like its sort of rough size so I can bring that back in later. And then up in this area here, if you do need to close the gap here between the back slat and that lower rail, very easy way to do that is to apply a clamp to the back slat and then clamp against that. So this method here will allow you to actually pull the back slat down into the mortise and fully seat those. So I know for sure mine are going to take a little bit of persuasion to get them fully seated. One thing I will point out about the back slats is if you look up in here into the crest rail, the slots are actually oversized. So it's going to allow you to compensate for any directional change you need. So if you need to adjust the angle of the back slot a little bit to get it fully seated nice and tight down here, you can do that because you do have a little bit of extra travel up there to get the angle absolutely perfect down here so it's fully seated. While we're talking about this connection here between the back slats and the top rail, one thing I'll point out here is that you do not want to glue those. So those are meant to be floating up in there because as someone is sitting in the chair pressing their weight into the back slat at that lumbar support, that curve at the bottom there, flexing that curve out is going to make the back slats longer and they need to go up into the crest rail. So they need a little bit of motion back and forth. So you don't want to glue those at all. Now, one thing to keep in mind with that is if you leave them unglued, there might be a little bit of rattle in there. So if your back slats are a little loose, we can use some silicone up in there. This is going to hold the back slats kind of firmly in place, but have some flexibility there for them to move. So the silicone will prevent that little bit of rattling you might have up in there in the crest rail. Now, lastly, we can talk about the clamping strategy up here for the leg into the crest rail. So if you have the live edge top like I do, you don't really have the ability to put a clamp and clamp in this direction. Like we did on the lower rail here, we could clamp directly to the leg and then clamp another one on top of the crest rail and pull all together. So we can use a 3 clamp setup here. We can put a clamp onto the leg, a clamp onto the crest rail, and use a clamp to actually draw them completely together. Now the only downside to this is you got to keep in mind as you're applying this top clamp on here, the rolling effect that can have onto the 2 pieces. So I have my clamp up here onto, I guess, the screw portion of the clamps, and that's going to cause the pieces to kind of roll in a little bit. Ideally, if you can get your clamps situated so that your pulling force is nice and low, as close to the surface as possible, that's going to prevent that rolling effect. But in reality, if you're kind of looking at things as you're doing your dry assembly and things are coming together, they just need a little bit of persuasion to fully seat, and you don't need to apply a whole lot of pressure, that doesn't really matter as much. You just want to watch this as you're working because it will cause these 2 pieces to roll a little bit and cause the gap to be open up on one side or the other depending on where you're pulling that clamp from. So I think we should be good to go. I got all my clamps kind of laid out here as needed as we go, and we can start actually getting some glue on here and making this assembly permanent. So now on the crest rail here, I'm going to apply a little bit of silicone. So this just needs to be a little bit of a glob down here. I'll put a glob on kind of either end of where the back slat will go. So just a little glob on either end, and it's going to just help keep that back slat in place and keep it from rattling. Now for some actual assembly, now that all of the glue is applied, start working through getting everything put together and seated. One thing that I will mention too, since I am all pre-finished here, I want to resist the urge to clean up any squeeze out that might be popping out at this point. If you try to clean it up right now with like a wet rag or something, what that'll do is basically it'll smear the glue into the finish and it will cause hazing. So you don't want to clean up squeeze out now. You want to leave that till later after the glue is cured, because once it's cured, it actually won't stick to the finish or the surface at all, and you can just flake it right off. So that is a later, a later task. So everything is sitting together, and we can kind of look and see what's going to need some additional loving. The first thing I'm going to do is apply my band here. That's going to allow the legs to fully seat and set that roll angle. You can see how they can kind of roll back and forth a little bit right now. But once they are fully seated into that mortise, the shoulders on the mortise lock against the sides of the legs, cause them to fully lock in place, and you get the actual roll angle on the legs correct. And like most things with this, you don't want to go too crazy overboard on the clamping, because the more pressure you apply, the more likely it is you're going to tweak apart and it won't fit together correctly. Okay, so my back slats need a little persuasion to get fully seated. So I'll put my clamp on kind of each of them here. And lastly, my connection up here at the crest rail. This side over here is looking pretty good. This side has a little bit of a gap, so I'm going to just persuade that one to close up a little bit. There we go. Doesn't take much, just enough to close that gap up and get it fully seated. This one still looks just fine, so that takes care of the glue up for the back assembly. So we can set this aside to dry for a bit, and we can work on the second assembly, the front assembly. So we need the two front legs, and we also need that center rail, this guy here. This one is definitely the easiest one, that's for sure. 3 components, 2 joints. Just make sure you put the glue in the right mortise. You want the face here with a single wide mortise. Not this face. That is not what you want. Don't put glue on that yet. That's for later. So we want to set these pieces up here with the side mortises facing up. So essentially we're inside the chair looking forward. The front rail is going to have the pocket hole screws here. That's going to face up, and we should have the 2 single mortises here towards the sides. And I can insert my tenon into here. And the only real detail you need to watch out for here is just to line up or flush up this top here, the top of the rail to the top of the leg. And we can go ahead and put a clamp on it. Now we do have the optional pocket holes here if you want to use them. So if you want to not use the clamp at all, you can put your 2 pocket hole screws in here and you can take your clamp off, and the pocket hole screws will hold that joint together while the glue cures if you wanted to kind of move this a little bit faster. So for instance, if you had the back assembly already glued up and ready to go, you could slam your pocket holes in here now, and then you would just be able to move forward with the next step without waiting for the glue to dry on this front connection. But since I just did that one, I'm just going to use the clamps. So once these are all dried, we can connect them together with all those rails, and that'll be the next step. The glue has dried on both of these assemblies, so I can take the clamps off of them, and we will do kind of the same thing with that connecting assembly. We'll get a feel for how our clamping strategy is going to go, and then we can go from there. So I have the chair dry assembled, and let me spin this around here and show you some of the clamping strategies, since we again have some kind of goofy and oddball things going on here. So first off, the top rail is actually kind of the easier one. It's very simple to just run a clamp from the front leg to the, I guess, the inner edge here of the rear leg, and you can clamp that closed really easily. That's an easy one to get. One little bit of caution here, I have a piece of cardboard back here to protect that edge, because you can damage that if you get that clamp head on there, kind of goofy. And this definitely only works if you're just trying to pull it together and finalize it. You really don't want to be cranking down this too much, and you really shouldn't need to. If you are cranking down it a lot, something else is wrong. So you want to just make sure you don't need a crazy amount of pressure, because that means something is probably wrong. So that was the easy one. If you need it down here to clamp the lower rail into those mortises, usually if this one's seating fully, you probably don't need one down here. But if you do, if you see a little gap, or you just want to apply a little pressure to hold it completely closed, that ratchet strap again is going to be a great friend, a great helper for you, because it can pull on this kind of weird type of shape. One little addition here you can see is I do have a clamp clamped onto the back leg, and that is there to catch the strap, because this is a curve here. So as you're cranking down on the strap, it's just going to want to walk up the back leg. So the clamp catches that strap, keeps it from walking up, and keeps the clamp in place, or keeps that ratchet in place. The front leg isn't really a huge deal, but if you do find it walking up, you can put a clamp on here as well. That'll stop it from coming up. So those are the two clamping strategies for your 4 rails. So with that, especially now we have a test assembled, we know it's going to work, we can start doing the last glue up, which is exciting. So I do need a little bit of pressure here to fully seat that lower rail. So I am going to put my ratchet strap on there. Once again, you want to watch where you're putting the actual ratchet and the hooks, because they will mar the wood. And again, you shouldn't need to apply a whole lot of pressure, but if you do find yourself wanting or needing to really crank down this ratchet, you're going to want to put something between the wood and the strap, because the strap can damage the wood. Just keep that in mind as you're working. A little bit of pressure, not a big deal, but if you need to start really cranking down this for some reason, you're going to want to put something on the wood to protect it. There we go. A little bit of gunk or something was hanging it up there, and now it's fully seated. So similar to the front rail, the side rail should be flush here with the top of the front leg. And the mortise back here, that tenon has a little bit of extra room to go up and down, so you can tweak the height of this rail to be exactly the right spot, so it ends up all nice and flush all the way around. Another thing you can do is, as you're working, you can make note of how far the rail is down from the back rail, and you want that to be the same on both sides. I have 1.25 inches on that side, and I have 1.25 inches on this side, so this rail is right where it needs to be. And I think I'll also grab a strap for the lower rail on this side too. Okay, my chair is all clamped up, but it's not quite ready to go. As if you can see, one little detail here, I have a rock in the chair. So if you can take out the rock at this point, it's going to save you a lot of work later on. So you ideally glue this thing up with no rock in it. I'll show you how to fix a chair that has a little bit of rock in it. It's It's not a huge thing to fix, but it's just one more thing to worry about. So let's see. I need to kind of tweak this, so I'll pick it up like this, and I'll push down on the high side. See if I can tweak a little bit and get some of that rock out. It's already a lot better. I can probably do that again. Even smack it with a hammer just to knock this side down. That is getting a lot better. There's still, you can see a tiny little wobble in here, but that's fine for now. We'll tweak that later once the frame is fully set. So you just don't want a huge rock. Would be a lot to fix. A little wiggle like this, not a big deal. You just want to make sure that this stage too, you glue this thing up on something that's flat. So I have my workbench here. You could use, the top of a table saw or something. You want somewhat of a flat reference surface to make sure it's actually glued up and not in a twist or anything like that. So before I leave it alone, I'm just going to double check my height here to make sure I am the same on both sides. I can also grab my seat and slide this thing on and see how that sits on there. If it's sitting on there nice and flat all the way around on all the rails, good to go. You can leave it alone, let it set, and then we can keep on moving forward. So the chair frame is all set up now. I can pull these clamps off and we'll be able to start working on getting the seat attached. However, I have one small thing I want to take care of first. I have all of the squeeze out cleanup that I want to just take care of while this chair is very easy to access, all the little nooks and crannies, and before it gets heavier. So let's clean up some squeeze out real quick and then we can get back to assembly. So here's a little glob of glue back here along the back leg to lower rail connection. So I have a chisel here and I can just go like that and loosen it up, set it free, and there we go. All nice and cleaned up, and you'd never know there was some glue squeeze out there. So to install our seat, the first thing we're going to need to do is attach all of our corner blocks. These corner blocks are what are going to allow the seat to be attached to the chair frame, and there are a couple things to keep in mind with the corner blocks. So first off, the corner blocks that go into the inside corners here, one in every single corner. And there are two different kinds of corner blocks. There are a shallow angle, these ones here, and there are a steeper angle, these ones here. So the steeper angle block, that's going to go in the back. The shallow angle block is going to go here in the front. The orientation of these, there is a hole here on, I guess, an edge. There is a counter bored hole, and then there's a through hole on the other side. You want that counter bored hole facing down towards the bottom because that's where the screw is going to come up into the seat, and that counter board is going to give a place for the head to go. The other thing you want to keep in mind with installing these things is you don't want them to be proud of the surface here. You want them to be either flush or, even better, just slightly below the surface. Slightly below the surface is going to leave a little bit of a gap here, so when the screw comes up into the seat, it's going to suck that seat down into the frame, keeping that connection nice and tight between the rails and the underside of the seat. So we're going to flip the chair frame upside down on the bench and start getting those blocks installed. So we have our two back blocks. We have our two front blocks. I'm just going to lay them in here to keep them all kind of arranged and organized. In your hardware pack, you're going to have three different sizes of screws. You'll have the 1¼ inch little pocket hole style screws. You'll have some 2-inch long screws, and you'll have some 2.5 inch long screws. The 2-inch long screws are going to be used to attach the seat to the blocks, and then the 2.5 inch long screws are going to be used with the corner blocks to pin them into the legs. So I have my blocks situated in here, and I have a piece of cardboard here I'm going to use as a shim or a spacer. So I can slide that here up underneath one of these blocks, and that's going to kind of hold that block up, which is going to create that gap to allow us to suck that seat down later on. Now, as you have your blocks in here, you may notice that the angles on the blocks aren't absolutely perfect, and they may not be hitting perfectly all the way around. That's okay. You can do two things here. The proper way to install that is going to be to orient the blocks so that the outside corners are touching evenly on both sides. With all the screws going in here, you don't need a necessarily perfect connection. But if you do want to tweak the actual angle on the blocks, that's not a big deal either. You can just take this over to a sander and just adjust the angle on here until it matches perfectly. Totally up to you. So the first step is going to be to use the smaller screws on the 4 outside holes on the face, which is going to connect the block into the rails. As you're installing these screws, one thing to keep in mind is you don't want to go too crazy with the tightening on here. What you could do at this point is tweak the frame. So you just spent that time doing that last glue up to make sure the frame is nice and flat and not rocking. You could overdo these screws and tweak the frame and introduce a rock. There's no need to go super crazy with the tightening of these screws. So with those taken care of, next grab the 2.5 inch long screws, and these will go through the corner block into the legs. So I just want to make sure I didn't tweak the chair at all as I was installing that. And this thing is still sitting nice and flat here. So I'm happy with that. So next we can start installing the actual seat. Just make sure we don't have any issues with the corner blocks. They're all below the surface, which is good. Make sure the seat sits on there nicely, which looks pretty good. So now I'm going to flip this whole assembly upside down, and we can attach the seat. So again, I have the chair kind of hanging off the back of my workbench here. I can butt the seat up in here, and I can play with the alignment to make sure I get this thing exactly where it needs to be along the radius here of that lower rail. So I'm going to press this chair up into the back of the seat, and I'm just kind of filling with my hands and looking back and forth here to make sure that the curve at the back of the seat kind of intersects the same place on the rear legs. It should be just a little bit past on both sides. I want to make sure that the seat is fully pressed into that back rail, which is looking pretty good. So I'm going to install the back screws first. I'll put one of them in and make sure that I am still aligned and everything is exactly where it needs to be. This is one of those details that kind of matters and kind of doesn't, because you can't really see how well the seat's aligned to the frame when the chair is right side up. Okay, it hasn't moved on me at all. My seat's still pressed back into the lower rail, and I'm even here between the side of the seat and the side of the front legs. So I can go ahead and drive the remaining 3 screws, and that'll be the last thing to install the seat. Okay, here we go. We can always try the sit test. Yeah, that's a chair. So that is the assembled chair, and now the last thing I want to do is address the rock that was in that chair as we're getting through the assembly, and it's gone. Just a little bit of tweaking here and there can have a little bit of an impact on that frame. So what probably happened here is either the corner blocks or the seat tweaked the frame in the opposite direction, pulling the rock out, and now the rock is completely gone, which is a nice thing to have happen just magically. But don't worry, if you do happen to have that rock in your chair, I'll show you how to take that out. Now, what if you get your chair assembled and it has a little bit of this going on? Just a little bit of rock. This is probably more than you'd really want to call good enough, but it's fairly easy to fix. So one thing I do want to stress, like as you're working through this whole thing, is if you can make sure this chair does not rock as you're putting it together, you're going to save yourself one less thing to do. But it is possible to still end up with a chair that rocks a little bit, but it's fairly straightforward to fix. All you need is a flat surface and a bit of coarse sandpaper. The first step is going to be to identify the long legs. So in order to do that, figure out where the rock is. So in my case, I'm rocking from this front corner to this rear corner here. Those are the short ones. So that means I need to shorten up the two long ones, which are going to be the opposite ones. So this corner here and this corner here. So it's up to you which one you want to address. I'm going to do the rear leg since it's right here. I have some coarse sandpaper here. You can stick it down to your flat surface. You can use some two-sided tape, carpet tape, spray adhesive. In my case, I'm using some packing tape just to get that piece of sandpaper just stuck there so it's not going to move as I'm adjusting this leg. Now it's just a matter of taking the leg and rubbing it back and forth on the sandpaper until we move enough material to make this thing not rock anymore. So after a few strokes on the sandpaper, this thing is now sitting like rock solid. It's not rocking anymore. So fairly simple to fix. It's just one of those things that if you can prevent having to do this, you'll have one less thing to do. So that takes care of the assembly of a chair kit in style 6, and the only thing left to do is to find a butt to put in this seat. So I hope you enjoy the assembly of your chair kit. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions along the way. Thank you for watching, and happy woodworking.